Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and we will make a start as we're running a few minutes after appointed time. Welcome to our session on leading humans and machines in knowledge organisations. I'm Mike Mister from the Moller Institute at Churchill College in the University of Cambridge in the UK, and it's my pleasure and privilege to host this afternoon with you. First task I have to do is to offer apologies from Gillian Secret, who is originally going to be moderating this session. Gillian is our CEO, and as such, from time to time, she gets asked to do things, and the master of our college has had something arise, and she's asked Gillian if she could stay with her to actually work that through. So Gillian has sent her huge apologies. She was very much looking forward to being here, and will likely be here next year, but this year she asked me if I could take over. So I'm going to be endeavouring to moderate and fill her shoes. I'm going to be making a contribution to the ongoing discussion, and my colleagues have also charged me with keeping time as we go through, so if we're late out of here, presumably that's going to be down to me as well. So I take full responsibility for that. Before we start, just wanted to get a quick gauge from you if we can. So a couple of quick questions, and we'll try just a little bit of gentle audience participation. So how many of you are currently using artificial intelligence as part of your core work that you're doing in your organisation? So just a quick show of hands, and I'm not coming back with a subsidiary question, it's just purely a data gathering exercise. So how many? 1, 2, is that yes or not? So 2, thank you, that's okay, great, thank you. And a follow-up question to that as well, which is, how many of you believe that AI is likely to be making an impact on the work you do and the way your work is going to be conducted going forward? I'm delighted to say you're in the right place. We hopefully have a few things to share with you that will be of interest. So before we get into the session proper, if I could just say a few words by way of introduction, and then I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. So my name's Mike Mister. I'm a partner at the Moller Institute at Churchill College, and have spent most of the last 25 years working in executive education in-house in a Big Four accounting firm, mainly in the leadership and change management area. So that's been my focus, and much of that time I've been working internationally. So although I've been based in the UK, I've spent an awful lot of time on airplanes travelling around the world. So with that, enough about me. Let me invite Sarah Michelle to say a few words, and then we'll work through the rest of the team.
Hello, my name is Sarah Michelle Lazarus. I am a technologist focusing in cyber defense.
Hello, I'm Liz Maltese. I'm a freelance consultant working mostly around leadership development and culture, and I'm particularly interested in the interplay between behaviour, culture and personality.
Hi everyone, my name's Taylor Harrell. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of San Diego in leadership studies, and I focus on team dynamics and how it affects team learning and performance. I also teach and research in the School of Leadership and the School of Peace Studies.
Hello, my name is Michael Seelman. I'm a leadership coach, consultant, and inspirational speaker. You can be the judge of that. I have a background in leadership where I did my undergraduate thesis with James McGregor Burns, my master's thesis project with Ron Heifetz, who we'll reference briefly in our presentation. I'd spent 19 years in the federal government, at the White House, at the FBI, and Department of Homeland Security. I spent about a decade at the FBI, where I had roles as the Chief of Employee Communications and Engagement. I supervised knowledge management and the innovation program at the FBI, and also led a national gun violence effort for reducing it in our most violent cities.
This is part of our technical limitation. We just have the one microphone. I think they're being rationed or something amongst the group. So you've probably noticed we are a very diverse group, and I mean age, as is obvious from the grey hair at this end, gender, nationality, work experience, how we've actually come to this topic as well. And we've also all brought different technical skill sets to this. And in fact, the technology we've used has been an eye-opener for some of us as well. And I won't say who has needed the most technological support and help for fear of embarrassing myself in such august company. So the structure of our presentation today, I'm going to shut up with these introductory comments in a few moments. I'm going to hand you over to Sarah Michelle, who wants to start laying out the territory and some of the initial issues we had to grapple with. Liz and Taylor will work you through the research methods that we used, how we went about doing this to make it work, and Liz will then lead us into the findings. We've carved those up amongst us, and what we'll do is actually share a little bit of those findings with you, each of us taking a lead on a part. And then, given that our focus has been very much practitioner, I've come up with some business recommendations that we've put together and we'd like to share with you. We'd then like to open it up for a question and answer, and we've got some time allocated for that. And then Michael's going to close us out with some thoughts about where we think this research could, should, maybe ought to go, and some of the implications as well going forward. So that's the first part. If I could just say a few extra words by way of introduction. There's a common theme that links us all. We all have some connection to the Moller Institute. And last year, as part of our 25th anniversary celebrations at the Moller Institute, we welcomed Professor Sorensen and the James MacGregor Burns Academy of Leadership to Churchill College. Opened a dedicated facility for visiting leadership scholars, so we have a lovely room set aside with library facilities and great internet and everything, so if you are heading towards Cambridge at any time, do let us know. That's there for you. Liz and I have both had a long association with the college, and Michael, Sarah Michelle and Taylor are all graduates from the James MacGregor Burns Academy of Leadership as well. So we met last year at one of those events, and Michael and I started a conversation which I'll refer to in a couple of moments. We also should note that we couldn't have done what we've done without the technology. Now, some of that has been a real challenge, as I've just alluded to, particularly for me, but our ability to connect, work the time zones, share documentation, etc., has just been huge, and we literally could not have done this without the technology we have today. So we started a conversation over a year ago now, Michael and I, just literally over coffee at an event, and we were concerned about the enormity of the amount of stuff in the press about artificial intelligence, and it started asking some questions for us about our clients, our consulting clients, Michael's coaching clients were experiencing this, and we started to ask questions like, what does this mean for leaders? What does it mean for the practice of leadership in organizations? How do you start to make sense out of all of this nonsense, much of which is in the media? Who else is researching and looking at this stuff? What has been found? And the answer we discovered was not a huge amount. So we thought it'd be interesting to get into this, to start trying to figure out and understand a little bit and see if we could generate some understanding. My final comment just before I hand over to Sarah Michelle was I was very mindful of Ira's session this morning when he said it's always a good thing to try and work the conference theme into your presentation. And I thought that kind of resonated with me, because what we're talking about is progress of some sort. Now, how peaceful that progress is going to be, what it does to people, and is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And that's not a political comment, it's intended to be a behavioural comment about just what does transpire. And I think, finally, the amount of prosperity this might generate and the impact that has on how widely it's distributed or not is going to be an interesting feature to watch as we go forward as well. So with that as some opening comments and background, let me hand over to Sarah Michelle, who's going to talk you through one of the first things we needed to figure out, which is to try and understand some of the terms that were in use. Over to you.
Thank you, Mike. There are many definitions of artificial intelligence. However, for a business leadership audience such as this one, the definition that we have on screen now seems most appropriate from McKinsey & Company. AI is the ability of a machine to perform cognitive functions we associate with human minds, such as perceiving, reasoning, learning, interacting with the environment, problem solving, and even exercising creativity. Examples of technologies that enable AI to solve business problems are robots, autonomous vehicles, computer vision, language, virtual agents, and machine learning. So what does this mean? Machines powered by artificial intelligence can do tasks previously thought to require the human mind. Tasks like recognizing complex patterns, or synthesizing information, drawing conclusions, and making forecasts. Time for some audience engagement. By a show of hands, how many of you believe that you have experience interacting with artificial intelligence? We have a fair amount of hands, some hands that aren't sure that they wanted to go up, so we're kind of halfway. So each of you likely benefits from or uses artificial intelligence in your everyday lives. Spam emails are filtered out of your inbox into a spam filter. You provide instructions to Alexa, and you also benefit from protections against fraudulent transactions on your credit card through AI banking applications. Audience engagement 2.0. By a show of hands, how many of you have used the Waze navigational app? A fair amount of hands went up. Waze is a good example of human and machine collaboration that has transformed how we navigate from place to place. It's a good example of when you consider how old GPS systems were essentially just a digital map. Now, Waze has inputs in real time about your speed, location, and inputs from humans regarding traffic accidents, road hazards, and other occurrences. Artificial intelligence is transforming many different sectors and is pervasive. You could see here a recent Time magazine cover. We just wanted to share a small sampling of problems that are being solved by our interviewees. Education technology companies are improving how students learn and engage with online material. AI is lowering the burden of coordinating medical professionals that look after children with complex medical conditions. Pay-as-you-drive insurance is changing how insurance is bought and sold on automobiles. And in the legal space, artificial intelligence can be leveraged for due diligence as part of mergers and acquisitions. When Henry Ford automated the production line, he automated human motion. It could be performed faster and more efficiently through a machine. Now we automate how to replicate human thought. There's a widespread misconception that machines will replace humans. That may be true for some jobs, but based on our interviews with knowledge organizations, it appears that in many cases, artificial intelligence will augment human capabilities and free up people to work on more complex or interesting cases, things that only a human could do. This graphic is helpful for understanding our focus on an area of human-machine collaboration that Dougherty and Wilson, in their book, Humans Plus Machines, Reimagining Work in the Age of AI, term the missing middle. On this spectrum, you can see on one side, human-only activity, and on the other side, machine-only activity. In the middle here exists an area of collaboration where humans and machines work together to amplify productivity and achieve orders of magnitude. These increases in accomplishment come as humans work with smart machines, each doing what they do best. This graphic shows that humans can complement machines through training, explaining, and sustaining, while AI gives humans superpowers through amplifying, interacting, and embodying. Of note, in a sense, a lot of ethical concerns regarding artificial intelligence are really based on ethical concerns that we already face as humans. They become amplified when our abilities are so profoundly amplified. Anything else to add?
Okay, so what I'd like to talk about briefly with Taylor is about how we actually approach the research. So we started off by defining our overarching research questions, which are basically, to what degree is AI and machine learning transforming strategy and operations in knowledge organizations? And then secondly, what do leaders and knowledge workers need to do to integrate and work with AI? So with those questions in mind, we then produced interview templates to do structured interviews and came up with a set of questions to probe each of those questions in some depth. And we had to do 3 interview templates because we were interviewing 3 different types of interviewee. So the first group were business leaders in knowledge organizations. And so typically we were interviewing people at a very senior level. So they tended to be chief executives, managing directors, chief technology officers, senior partners. So this is very much a top-down, so what we've done so far with our research is very much a top-down view. We also interviewed service providers, people who are either developing technology or other services like patent attorney work or consultants or lawyers to companies who are dealing with issues around artificial intelligence or trying to introduce it into their business. And our final group was some academics who are working in this field, and there the interviews are very much taking a longer term view and trying to discover what's likely to be coming up in the world of artificial intelligence over the next 10, 15, 20 years, so to get that longer term view. So in all, we interviewed between 30 and 40 people, and we did structured interviews, which typically lasted for about an hour, so we got some good detail here. And we did them either face-to-face, by phone, or by video conference. We then made interview notes, which we loaded onto a great piece of technology which Taylor introduced us to called Deduce, which made the analysis much, much easier. And I really wish I'd had this 20 years ago when I started doing this kind of work. So then what Taylor and I did is we produced a coding framework. And with our first template for the coding framework, then Taylor and I applied it to one interview to actually see whether it was valid and whether it needed refining. And then we refined it before passing it out to the rest of the team so that each interview was coded by at least 2 team members. So then that gave us the data, which we were then able to analyze with the use of Deduce to come up with our findings and what the key themes were, which we'll be talking about in a minute. So now what I'd like to do is to hand over to Taylor, who's going to talk a bit more about the methodology.
I just want to highlight the methodology approach that we took. We would call this in academia, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here probably at ILA, many of us in the room are academics, but we took a grounded theory approach because this phenomenon, specifically the phenomenon of integrating artificial intelligence into a knowledge organization and understanding what it's doing through the lens of leadership, that phenomenon has not been well studied. I get an email from a Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey newsletters probably once a week highlighting something new about the technology of artificial intelligence, but the grounded theory really allowed us to explore the phenomenon of leadership interacting with the artificial intelligence. And so I think this is what makes our methodology unique and appropriate choice for this particular study. And then it gave us a real solid starting off point or jumping off point for future research that we plan to do after this point. Okay? Fine.
Right, okay. So what I'd like to do now is just to talk a bit about our overarching framework for our findings. I mean, it was amazing how much data we collected in the interviews, and I mean, it certainly exceeded my expectations. I mean, we had about 30 to 40 different codes, and we could talk about things like speed, the importance of realistic goals. We could talk about culture, engagement, failure, different attitudes to AI, readiness for AI, opportunities and risks. You know, there really was masses of stuff coming out of the data. And I know that when we go back and do the next phase, you know, we will be coming up with a lot more stuff. So what we tried to focus on was try and identify what are the 5 areas that leaders really need to think about in integrating AI into their organizations. And so this is what this framework's about. It is not exhaustive, and there's a lot of interplay between the different areas. So just to talk very briefly about each of them. So what you'll see around the outside is this whole thing about what we've called it AI knowledge and mindset. So this, and we'll be going into each of these in a bit more detail in a minute. But this is basically about leaders needing to have this basic understanding of what AI can potentially do for their business. And how leaders go about building that knowledge, both within their executive team and within the wider organization. And the importance of this is to actually get beyond the hype. You know, what can really be done, not just what's actually in the press. And also the thing about mindset, you know, with knowledge workers, you find that the head is really, really important. And so that whole thing about mindset around our AI and the shift that's needed there is absolutely critical. The second area is vision and strategy. Lots of the people that we interviewed, who typically a lot of them tended to be of my generation, were referencing classic models of change like Kotter and things like that. And they'd found them very useful guides in terms of implementing our AI, with one significant difference. You know, if you look at Kotter, in his work, vision and strategy is clear at the start of the change process. What we're finding with AI is it tends to be a lot more emergent. You know, you're probably starting off the process of AI with the glimmer of an idea, and the vision and strategy will emerge over time and will continue to develop as organizations get into deeper and deeper into it. So within the center, there are these 3 overlapping circles. And the first one is, we've called it optimizing organizational, I'm getting my words muddled up, optimizing organizational infrastructure. And basically this poses the question about how ready is your business for AI innovation? Do you have the right structure and systems in place to enable its successful application? The second piece, I mean, culture just came up in every interview, and almost every question we asked, culture was mentioned, no matter whether we were talking to academics, to business leaders, or to service providers. And so what we think it's really important to do is to explore the kind of culture that's needed for successful application of AI. Finally, there's the whole piece about talent and the strategies that leaders need to put in place to make sure this is a win-win for both the organization and the people working for it, both in terms of existing jobs, future jobs, skills lost and skills needed as we enter into this new world. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to does anyone else want to say anything about the basic framework? That's good. Okay, so Mike. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to take the first stab on the first of the issues here, which is about AI knowledge and mindset. And the question was just how much do the leaders really need to know about this? And so what became very clear from the people we were speaking with and interviewing is the ability to ask the right questions and crucially listen, and listen really deeply to what was being said, was really important. The idea that they needed to have a detailed understanding of the algorithm and the math underneath it was false. But what they did need to know was how to ask the questions, and we were reminded in detail of this of Keith Grint's presentation yesterday. Keith was talking about this idea of constructive dissent and how do you build an organisation where you can have that level of constructive dissent so you are hearing the messages that are coming up. And there are clearly issues here related to the construction of the algorithms, how you actually procure and buy them, and how do you actually have some surety around what those algorithms are doing, and knowing that. Now, how much detail they need to know versus having the right team around them to provide that information back is a separate issue. We were reminded as well yesterday that there was a news feed came through that said the Serious Fraud Office in the UK judiciary have just reviewed a case, a fraud case that required 30 million documents to be reviewed. And this was done in a matter of a couple of days using a piece of proprietary software that's available off the shelf to use. If you just think about what that might have meant in terms of human power needed to process that much stuff in space, it's just phenomenal. So the issue here about demystifying the AI is about asking questions, listening, and it's about realizing that there is logic under this, underpinned by huge amounts of data. That's the first point, and the quote we came with here from, again, one of our participants was, it's not magic, it's maths. And for people to actually understand there is a logic underpinning this was important. The second part of the mindset really focused very much on mindset, which is about getting your inspiration from elsewhere. One of the interviewees said that in the legal area, law is the last man standing. So human resources, marketing, finance, information technology have all gone down this route ahead. And so the idea here is the skills of the leader having some form of appreciative inquiry in their mindset, actually trying to figure out and understand what's happening elsewhere and being able to bring that back in is important. A related concept in here is that of collaboration, and what we're seeing as well is hitherto competitors who need vast quantities of data to build their machine learning, and they also need financial capital starting to collaborate. So that's potentially fundamentally changing the dynamics of some of the marketplaces. The third part of this was around curiosity, and this is about the leaders being open-minded, about questioning, being inquisitive, and moving beyond simply process improvement, because a lot of the early AI work was very much about how do we simplify process or speed up process. That's assuming there was a process there in the first place. So the question here was, what else can it do beyond just improving the robotics of a process? And this is about using tools like design thinking to re-engineer the way the work is actually done within the organizations. So those are the first cut that we took out of this, looking at the AI knowledge and mindset and what leaders needed to know. So let me hand over to Sarah Michelle to talk a bit about the vision and strategy piece.
Vision and strategy are emergent as you start to test and refine solutions. New possibilities will start to emerge as the process is iterative. One theme we heard a lot in our interviews is to start with the business problem that you would like to solve. Don't start with the technology. A lot of folks are interested in artificial intelligence, but the recommendation is to think about problems that are worth solving for your business and how to solve them. Put the problem that needs to be solved first instead of focusing on the technology of artificial intelligence. One example is when Netflix was still using mail-in DVDs, they began to use a software recommendation algorithm to increase their rentals. This worked by recommending movies that each customer might like based on previous movies that they liked, and as well as recommendations from other users. Another finding was to identify if or how the business model and strategy will change. You can use artificial intelligence not only to change how you do business, but it can inform strategic decisions. You could take the guesswork out of some decisions by applying AI modules to your data sets to answer questions. So for example, you might be able to, based on data, determine should you expand into a geographic region, or if and when should you increase production and by how much. You can also use it as a core part of how you do business. AI can reduce expense or increase revenue. Law firms can have a better tool for assessing whether to take on a new case based on information and data sets related to outcomes from the judge. That's one example that we saw in some of our interviews for how the business model and strategy could change with artificial intelligence. Another finding related to strategy and vision is around access. It's important to provide access channels to new ideas, facilitate easy and timely communication across teams and to the executive team. Also, don't be afraid to be the champion of new ideas. Sometimes people within an organization might be afraid of something new, but if it fits the vision that you have for your organization, it's worth it to champion these new ideas.
Okay, so what I'd like to talk about is about the organizational infrastructure. And I'm going to focus on three things: about taking a long-term perspective, the whole how you approach investment, also how you create a organization that can actually do this either within your organization, and finally how you leverage outside expertise. So if we start with the whole thing about a long-term perspective, in many sectors this would be blindingly obvious. I've worked with Shell and BP, where they have whole teams of people who are producing 30 and 50-year business plans and doing lots of scenario planning. But within lots of knowledge businesses, life is very, very different. They tend to take, often they're selling services business to business, providing sort of consulting, legal advice, accounting advice, whatever. And the focus is very short term. It's about task, it's about getting the job done. Yet Mike and I have spent years working with law firms, and to be honest, if they have an 18-month planning horizon, they're doing very well. Generally 3 to 6 months is a lot more likely. We also interviewed people in financial services, and what they found there was mitigated against the long-term perspective is, they're very much driven by the tyranny of the quarterly reporting cycle. Now, this has all sorts of positive benefits in terms of control and profitability and monitoring progress, but it also, when you're dealing with something which takes a long time to implement, and maybe a long time from initial pilot through to reaping financial benefits, that quarterly approach can be really quite damaging. And finally, the other thing is about people in these businesses tend to either have a task focus or an operational focus. So making the space to think long term is not something that comes naturally to them. And indeed, in a separate piece of research that Mike and I were involved in, we found the whole thing about providing direction was the weakest competency within professionals, and the thing that they actually found most difficult and were scared of. A second challenge is really how some of the quotes that we had, this whole thing about taking the long-term view, it's really highlighted about it not fitting with quarterly reporting. Another one of our interviewees talked about their functional leaders having just this short-term 12-month planning horizon. So I think the leadership challenge here is how do you and your executive team start looking at the long-term implications of the technology, and also manage expectations so that they're realistic about the short-term payback, which really moves us on to the next question, which is all about investment. And what you find in some knowledge organizations is their attitudes to investment don't really fit that well with what you need for AI, because you've got a really big upfront investment needed, both in terms of the money and the time from the people in the organization to customize whatever solution they're buying to the needs of their business. So the problems around investment, the short-term perspective, and also many of the businesses that we interviewed are partnerships. So, which sets up a whole set of problems, because basically any profit has to be distributed at the end of each year for tax purposes. So there's not this huge cash reservoir to draw on for big investments. And also the people at the top of the business, they tend to be people Mike's age and my age, so they're very unlikely to reap the financial benefits of introducing artificial intelligence. The other thing that makes it difficult around investment is the attitude to failure, which Michael will talk a bit more about in the culture piece. And you know, the risk is that many AI projects will fail initially and take a number of iterations to actually get right. And this is in a sector where getting it right first time is really, really important. So they're not likely to take too kindly to that. And finally, the whole thing, many of these knowledge businesses are very, very small. So they just don't have the capital needed for the upfront investment, which in itself seems to be driving change within that sector. So in one of the people we're interviewing, which was a partnership, it was a large law firm, they're actually doing an IPO to raise the funds for investment in technology to secure their future. We're also starting to see consolidation with smaller firms coming together and the need to invest in technology being a big driver for this. So the challenge, I think, for leaders is, you know, they really need to take a commercial decision where they're not just looking at the hype and everything else, but they're really looking at the costs, the benefits, and the risk. And they also need to think about ways of funding that separate the investment needed from their current financial reporting arrangements and all the stuff that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And this really brings us on to what we've called a designated space. Michael will be talking about culture in a lot more depth in a minute, but what we found within this sector is some cultures kill innovation because they're hypercritical, they analyze everything to death, and they have zero tolerance for failure. I mean, a really good example of this. But just they're very busy. There's not the space for leaders to think about innovation. One chief technology officer that I interviewed, he said it can take him 3 months to get into his boss's diary to discuss a new idea. Which is just kind of crazy when you're talking about something which could have such strategic significance. So I think really leaders need to think radically about how they create a structure which supports AI innovation. And what we've seen, and the good news is in our interviews, we found that there are many options. There isn't one, there's no magic bullet here, but there's lots of possible approaches. So what a number of the businesses we interviewed, they actually set up a separate arm's length company with a different structure, different culture, different governance, different funding, different reporting, which would then develop all the AI applications for transfer back into the organization. So they could develop this unaffected by the cultural norms of the parent company. Other approaches that we heard that worked were things like innovation labs, accelerators, skunk works, and also perhaps not doing it in-house, but setting up in partnership with a smaller entrepreneurial business that already exists to develop the solution, which is then transferred back. And obviously, the really important thing is if you are doing it with an arm's length business or partnering with an entrepreneurial business, the important thing is to be able to second people from the parent company to provide the subject matter expertise, because the best solutions are about when the technology is actually tailored to meet your business's very specific requirements. The other thing we heard, and I think Mike referenced it earlier, is the importance of actually leveraging outside expertise. I think everyone mentioned this, every person that we interviewed. So we had people saying, initiatives don't work when businesses try to do it all themselves. And, the best solutions combine your business knowledge with other people's technical knowledge. One law firm we interviewed, they'd been looking at Netflix, Amazon, Bohu, isn't it? Bohu? I can't, it's a shopping thing, isn't it? Banks, as well as the legal sector. And what we saw is them starting to work with a whole range of external people. Your typical consultants, the people you'd be expecting, the Microsofts, the IBMs, Big Four accounting firms. We also saw heard about interesting collaborations with academics, and very blurring lines between academia and business around artificial intelligence, with some people holding roles in both academia and business at the same time, and this interflow of knowledge between them. We also saw collaboration with tech providers, smaller businesses, and most interestingly, collaboration between erstwhile competitors in the same sectors to develop technologies and to create databases that were large enough to actually train the machines. We also see it in terms of new hires coming into companies. So what we're seeing is a need to upskill existing IT teams so that they have both the business understanding and the knowledge of the emerging technologies, so they're able to tailor solutions. And another good example would be around legal teams having to boost their experience to deal with all the data processing issues for which they probably don't have the expertise now. So in terms of what leaders need to do, there's a whole thing about making sure that there are people around them who have the brief to look externally for good new ideas which may be relevant to their business. And encouraging people to look beyond their own sector, and perhaps most importantly, to encourage active collaboration with a wide range of people. I think the other thing that's just really important to say is not up on the slide, is something about systems and actually making sure you've got the right systems in place, because systems tend to drive behavior. And one of our respondents talked about how you need to rewire rewards so that people are actually doing the things that are important to the successful integration of artificial intelligence. So the kind of systems and processes that you need to be thinking about are your process for innovation, for performance evaluation, for compensation, and also for graduate and graduate training programs, which Taylor will talk a bit more about later. And finally, the whole question about business ethics. And I think one of the things that businesses need to think about is how do you put in place systems to do the due diligence on the systems that you're buying? How do you test and check for bias and unintended consequences in the systems that you're actually introducing? There's an ongoing need to sort of audit the algorithms, and also to ensure that the quality of the data that's used to teach the machines is really good. It's not introducing unintended bias. Okay, so who am I handing? I'm handing over to Michael, who's going to talk a bit more about culture.
Thank you, Liz. So when we look at the cultural shift, the first thing that comes to mind is we had an interviewee who talked about what machines and humans are good at, and he said that AI might be able to solve some technical challenges, but what they can't solve is adaptive challenges, like in the theories of Ron Heifetz. And cultural shift is one of those adaptive challenges that really require leadership. And we broke it down into 4 different elements. The first element to talk about is trust and ethics. And the trust we talk about is between the humans and trusting the machines. So when we talk about the trust between the humans, there's also this, in some theories like Burns's theories, this moral aspect to leadership. And we had heard from people at this conference, and we heard from Cynthia this morning talking about trust, right? And that leaders have to create that space of trust. And that there's a bond that comes from having an ethical relationship from your people, with your people. So if there's going to be change that's going to be brought about with AI, and yes, there will be, because it's a disruptive technology that can change businesses. So have some honesty about that when you're talking with your people. And also thinking about how can you increase their trust in the machine. And some of the researchers we talk with have that expertise about that human-machine interface and what leads humans to trust machines more. And that's having some transparency to what's going on in that black box, as Mike talked about earlier, demystifying that. That helps people trust it more. Having some way of challenging the outcomes that the machines come to, that also will lead to more trust in what the machines produce. And when you look at design and engagement, you can also, what comes to mind is one of the interviews that we did with this professor at Harvard. And he had actually moved from MIT, where he was focused in engineering and having, he called it like technical beauty to what he created with artificial intelligence, with accuracy and speed, and that were the things that we was measuring. And he actually changed from that area of research and went to Harvard and went into that human-machine interface. He realized what good is the beauty or the accuracy of what the AI produces if humans won't use it, and it doesn't benefit them. So he kind of changed his focus of research, even his institution, to say he wanted to produce things that humans will use and they will find valuable. And so that's really important with the design and engagement. When you get to the experimentation and innovation, which is something that Liz alluded to, it's really important to have that cycle of trying, failing, learning, trying again. And not all organizations have a high tolerance for that. And as Liz alluded to as well, you have to protect that innovation. We have that quote up there. It says, leaders spend lots of time protecting the innovation team from the rest of the company. So that's a quote we heard from these leaders, that you have to protect that incubation, whether it be longer than the gestation or maturation period that they're used to in that company. So it has to be protected. And then when you're designing that engagement, you want to design it so that it leads to lots of collaboration and engagement of your workforce. So when you're thinking about bringing that AI in and what business processes it might help, it's really important to involve them in that process. Then when it starts to come into the organization, we had talked with one service provider, talked about demoing it with live data in that organization so they can see it's in my domain. It does things much faster than we could do as humans by ourselves. And then when you have that collaboration also inside the organization so that it makes sure that it's relevant and solves the business problem, as we heard earlier, it's really important to have cross-disciplinary teams, people that really understand the business problem, understand that domain, married with technologists and data scientists working in cross-functional teams, and valuing the different roles that people play. So that's one thing, and even when you think about that collaboration, technology can also help with inclusion, because technology can be used for good or for harm. So the AI is not necessarily good or evil, it's how leaders employ it. One of the researchers that we interviewed, she was actually using AI to help people with disabilities participate more fully in their life and in the workplace. And so it can be used for those different ways. It's up to us as leaders to help make that cultural shift so our workforce can embrace it, can adapt the skills they need to, can collaborate to make it successful and prosper, as Mike talked about earlier. So next I'll pass it over to Taylor to talk about talent.
So this is the last section of the core elements that we found in our data. And when we speak about artificial intelligence, I think it's easy to focus on the technology and what it can do or what it can't do, or the fact that we may not understand it fully. And I think that we also must keep in mind that people are at the heart of our organizations. And so we have to keep in mind how this technology is affecting our own. And when we looked at the data, we found that there were really 4 domains that showed up. The first element speaks about acquiring talent. And it sounds a little bit transactional, but I assure you that it's not, because this is really the part of the data where people were speaking about the fear that emerges of, are jobs going to go away? Are the jobs that we currently have, will I be qualified enough to continue to fulfill these roles? These are real fears of people in organizations. There's a study published by McKinsey that projected we will need 2 to 4 million data scientists by the year 2025. So 6 years from now. We currently have 200,000 in the US. And when we have really difficult artificial intelligence problems, things that need a little bit more expertise, we only have about 10,000 people that know how to do that. So what does that mean for the people that we'll need in our organization to be able to fully integrate artificial intelligence? It means a couple things. The first thing is that we need to understand the type of people that we will bring in from the outside, the type of expertise and knowledge that we'll need. And so that may require spending resources, time, money on being willing to hire those folks and recognizing that that is an investment in the long term rather than kind of looking at some of the costs that might show up in the short term. The other aspect of that is looking at the workforce that you already have and saying, what are the opportunities, the folks that are in our organizations, that we can invest in, that we can really take the opportunity to help them reskill to begin to contribute to the organization in another way. One element of the data that I thought was really interesting research is that this report was saying across the domains, many sectors in the US, 60% of the jobs that people currently do, only 30% can be automated. Meaning that it's really just about re-envisioning how we see that role. Okay, so some part of my job might be given to artificial intelligence, or I may collaborate with artificial intelligence in order to do it better, faster, more accurately. But the parts that really require the human aspects, the judgment, the moral dilemmas, making those types of decisions, those will not be able to be replaced. And so I think that thought is really important, and leaders have to keep that in mind whenever addressing the fear that or the anxiety that people may experience. And it was only projected that maybe only 5% of jobs would be fully replaced, right? Which, whenever you consider the hype that we've all talked about, is, of course, it's significant, and we have to consider those repercussions. But just like the previous industrial revolution, that was a natural part of the change process. And so leaders have to consider whether you're in business or whether you're in higher ed and you're thinking about how are we preparing our students for this workforce. Those are things that we have to consider to smooth this transition as we really move into this fourth revolution. The other thing that we're beginning to see are new roles, titles that you would have not necessarily heard 15, 20 years ago. People hiring for the director of digital transformation, right? That's new. Or the chief technology officers. And it's not just about the title, but it's about the mindset and the skill set that you need in that role, which is if you're taking up those types of roles, you need the technological understanding and the business acumen and the leadership skill set. Okay? That integration is absolutely core. We can no longer expect people to come to work and have siloed skill sets because we're really seeing this integration fully. And I think that that begins to then speak to the way that we also form our teams, right? We're not only expecting individuals to have multiple skill sets, but we want to really see what we call, or what's called agile teams. These are, this is a kind of a not a buzzword, but a jargon term in tech companies, but you're starting to see it move across sectors. Agile teams are cross-functional teams that stick together and solve problems together, that have very different skill sets, but have learned what is called a translation skills. So how can I communicate what I know about psychology and leadership studies to our resident technologist, and can we speak the same language so that we can then work together, right? And so that's absolutely critical, and organizations, regardless of if you're in higher ed, which I am right now, and I know we're totally siloed in terms of our departments and the way that we work together and prepare students. I mean, even folks, we have multiple departments in the same building, and we don't talk about how we're offering our students an interdisciplinary experience. And I think that that is doing our students a disservice moving forward. So we really need to be thinking about, regardless of if you're in a business or if you're in an institution, how are we preparing people to be a part of agile teams? The last element is the training and development of our people and organizations. And because we will have artificial intelligence, for instance, in a legal firm, preparing some of the grunt work, right? So the entry-level folks might be really excited about the fact that they don't have to sift through hundreds and thousands of pages of legal documents. But what that does for somebody is it allows them to do this monotonous, repetitive work, but it really gives them a deep understanding of the structure of the rules of legal work, and builds their ability to make sound judgments as they begin to move beyond that work and up in the organization. So how do we, if we're going to integrate AI, for instance, to be able to review 30 million documents, yes, that is wonderful for our ability to take on a class action lawsuit to do that. But then when we're thinking about how we train and develop our entry-level staff to still be able to have that same capacity of judgment, we need to get really creative and thoughtful about how we're going to do that. And so this was an issue or an element that came up in the interviews. And one of the interviewers said, do all lawyers need to code in terms of thinking about how we reskill people? No, that's not what we're saying, right? One of the things that Mike was speaking to, though, earlier was just a basic knowledge of how artificial is connecting to the vision and the purpose of the organization and how it affects my daily work. Those are going to be the things that knowledge workers want to know, and those are going to be the critical things. Anything else to add on that? Great. Okay.
Okay, I'm conscious and we are flattered that a number of you have been taking notes and pictures as we've been going through. So if I could urge you, if there's one of the pictures that is worth taking a photo of, we think it's probably this one. We've tried to synthesize down what we've been talking about. And I know from when I've been sitting where you are at these sessions, I typically will write down a pithy quote. So we try to make these as pithy and relevant. And these are directly lifted from the conversations that we've had. They're also unashamedly practitioner-based. So our mission at the Moller Institute and Churchill College is to bring academia and business together. So this is very much aimed at a business-type audience. So first issue is start with the business problem and not the technology. It never ceases to amaze me personally, but also our experiences, the search and the quest for the bright and shiny and new. So can we just bring something new in? Let's just follow what others are doing. And so the quote that we came to here was this idea that a fool with a tool is still a fool, potentially a more powerful fool, but still a fool. The second is, and you may have seen yesterday, there was a very interesting piece of art sold for $432,000, created by artificial intelligence. It had produced this thing, they'd scanned in a load of old masters and stuff and said to the machine, produce an artwork, which it has done, and it's now been sold for $432,000. So the point it raised for us was, don't get sucked in by the hype. This is publicity, it's stuff that's out in the main, but just what are you really trying to do? And the quote we came from our research on this was, people overestimate the impact of artificial intelligence in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. So overestimate in the short term, overestimate in the long term. Sorry, underestimate in the long term. Next point was suspend initial critical judgments. In knowledge workers and the professions particularly, they are charged with giving advice. They have to get advice right, and particularly on this side of the Atlantic, lawsuits tend to flow if you get it wrong. So suspending critical judgment is important. And so the idea here is to understand there is logic here, and there is a logic based on masses of data. So it's not magic, it's maths, but understanding the limitations of that and what it's based on is important. The next point was building a tolerance of failure in a sector that prides itself on getting things right. We came, again, a lovely quote that said, in science, an experiment that doesn't support a hypothesis is data. It's not a failure. Unfortunately, in the professions particularly, a failure is something that is very difficult to countenance. Next point was about the leaders themselves, and admitting your own ignorance is a sign of strength when you are leading people and you don't actually know what they're doing. And so the quote that came from our research here was, look, you just have to hire people you trust to go out and things that you don't understand. And again, that talks to a lot of the issues that we've been listening and hearing about at this conference. Senior leaders need to enable collaboration. That's between technical specialists, subject matter experts, organisation, people who understand their own organisation, and new kinds of interdisciplinary teams, as Taylor was just talking about. So, quote here was, we spend a lot of time communicating and building engagement to get people interested and excited and to stick with it over time. So it's not just a one and done, a short, sharp shock. This is something that needs to work with over the duration. And then the final point, and again, Liz talked very eloquently about this, this is a long-term play, both in terms of the cash needed, which is huge, but also the time. And particularly in the professions and the knowledge workers, which is a sector that sells time, stuff that isn't immediately producing results is a source of concern. And the quote that really struck us very forcefully, and this was about the measures that were indicated herein, was you need to take a long-term view over a decade, which doesn't fit well with quarterly reporting. So you start to put all of those bits and pieces together. This is clearly a complex area. This was a pilot study. It was something that we thought was interested and needed investigating. We just like to stop because we're conscious we've been talking at you for the best part of an hour, which was the plan. But we're very interested if there are questions or comments, your thoughts, views and observations. We would welcome having some of that. And once we've done with that, I'll give Michael 5 minutes or so to just close up. So over to you, your thoughts, comments, observations, questions. Please.
The existing leader cannot exercise such leadership because the existing leaders of the knowledge industry, maybe this is my assumption, could not exercise appropriate leadership in order to cope with this technological or maybe adaptive challenge. That's my impression. But
thank you for that question. So the question there is just, can the leader that was used to a certain way of doing business, when that business sector might change radically, can it have the same leader? And I would say it could be, but there has to be someone that's open to new ways of doing business, and it could be radically new ways of doing business, like you're alluding to in an accounting firm. I'll give you an example of, I had this conversation with a former police chief that now works with a company that does digital forensics. And he said, if I was a homicide detective now, in this era of AI powering digital forensics, and I came upon a murder scene, he said I would probably walk by the dead body, I might even walk by the murder weapon if it was lying there, and I'd go to the smartphone. And that's the first thing that I would pick up. I would look at that smartphone and use the AI, the digital forensics, to analyze it and solve that homicide case. That's the first thing he would do. So this is someone that's a retired chief, but he was able to think differently about his business and how AI can empower and change the whole way a detective might approach a case. So if you have a leader with that open mindset that's open to learning new things, he doesn't know how necessarily the algorithm works, but he knows that it can empower and help solve a case much faster than the traditional way of investigation. Similar to an accounting firm, maybe it's not going to be done the same way. You may not understand, as Mike said, every nuance of how it is, but you hire people that can help you do that faster and more effectively.
Thank you. So my question has to do with if we're looking at this, so this is sort of big picture, 10 years is a long time for an organization. So I had two. One is, can you provide, and I think the example that you gave just now is a good one, maybe a shorter term example of how this might be put into practice, something that may be 1 or 2 or even 3 years as opposed to a 10-year window of how this is actually put in practice. And then the other piece of this is, I'm interested in leadership, but also performance improvement. How are they measuring? I mean, if you're talking about a 10-year investment, that's huge bucks. You know, so how are they saying this is getting us to a better place at the end, and what are some of those scorecard measurements that they might be using? Right now I'm in academia. I used to work in a financial, I've worked in professional services most of my
Can I give it? I'll give it, Cynthia. I'll give you a professional services example from one of the law firms that I've interviewed, who see AI as totally transforming what they do, enable them to offer a very wide range of services. So they started by what they've started by doing is looking at areas of the practice where you have to churn massive amounts of data. And it took them about 2 to 3 years to sort of like go from initially starting to think about this. So they started looking at the due diligence that takes place for merger and acquisition work. So masses of documents, masses of contracts that need actually going through. So having identified the technology, but what they did before they even looked at the technology, they used design thinking to look at ways the process could be streamlined, and then how technology could actually enable that, right? So then knowing what they wanted to do, the business problem that they wanted to solve, they could then go out and start looking for the technical provider, and had a really clear way of evaluating it. They have an arm's length company, you know, just for funding reasons, because at the moment they're a partnership, although this firm, this is out in the public arena, are going for initial public offering to raise capital. So having set this up, they start seconding the subject matter experts into that team to work with the innovation people and the technologists to start, you know, identifying the data that needs to go in and sort of trialing it. And as they kind of went through the process, they gradually pulled in more and more people from this team. So by the time it had been tested, 30% of the team had taken part in the design of the system. So actually, and people could see that it worked, and they were going back and talking to their colleagues. So actually, then when it was actually launched on everything, you know, and then what they actually did is they trialed it by taking a M&A piece of work that had already been concluded successfully and redoing it with AI to check that it produced similar outcomes. And so then what they kept doing is they then sort of build it, you know, testing it on more and more things, and until they've had the confidence to actually use it on a new matter without actually having the parallel process of it being done in an analog way. Does that? Okay.
I actually wanted to add something to the answer to the previous question based on could leaders continue in the organization even if they're not familiar with artificial intelligence. And something I wanted to point out is I think they can absolutely continue with success to lead organizations even without a background in artificial intelligence, because when you're leading and looking at data and results from AI, you should have a gut feeling based on whether or not this could be true. The same thing as you might with anything that you outsource to somebody else. And we use this in many very serious professions with little room for error. For example, a pilot who's flying a plane, a lot of times the autopilot is flying the plane, and the pilot himself is up front in the cockpit making sure everything seems okay. The autopilot might be doing most of the flying, although as a passenger you'd be very nervous if you opened the door to the cockpit and no one else was in there. So you have this co-pilot, or this person, making sure that everything's okay.
Just a corollary to that one, when your plane lands and it's particularly bumpy landing, that's probably the human doing it, as I've been told. So, Georgia, sorry, you didn't make a comment.
Thanks. I always make a point of going to the sessions that are really on the cutting edge of leadership work. So I really appreciate what you're doing. And I hope you'll consider submitting to our journal. I have one concern about, well, first of all, I'm very interested in the idea of AI in medical devices and research. It's just phenomenal what they can do to assist surgeons and look at large sets of data and make decisions. So that's really phenomenal to me. My concern is if you saw Mark Zuckerberg testify before Congress, he looked like a kid who was driving a Lamborghini with a learner's license. He didn't have the slightest idea what people were doing. And Plato talks about trust, but trust has to be developed over time. And Mark Zuckerberg didn't know the people he hired, for the most part. And he doesn't really know what's going on with his company either. And we're in a lot of trouble because of it. And so I wonder about the issue of trust and the Mark Zuckerbergs and where the gap will be filled when we have these brilliant mathematicians, and also what will happen to cosmology and other beautiful sciences when they're all seduced by these technology efforts.
I just want to respond to that because actually last night at dinner with some of our USD colleagues, we were speaking about this presentation and the issue of ethics came up. And how do you teach ethics in the age of artificial intelligence? And what I think is fascinating about psychological studies on empathy, right, is the closer in proximity you are to the people in pain, the more likely you are to make better decisions that will, have better outcomes for them. And so I think that is one of the core problems, and actually one of the future directions we talked about in our research is how do you, looking at ethical leadership development around this topic for those reasons, because if you have brilliant folks creating these technologies, as we said, I heard a term actually today that was malevolent creativity, right? Fascinating to think about how then as leaders do we consider the repercussions, because the repercussions can be extremely profound.
So just to kind of build on those comments, and Georgia, your question, so it just shows the need for having interdisciplinary teams, different levels of experience, like we tried to mirror in our team here, people from different generations, people with different understandings of technology, but also bring many leadership lessons or a strong rubric of ethics. So it's very important to have all those people together. I happen to be a leadership coach, and several of my clients are founders of company in Silicon Valley. And, but they have sought out a leadership coach to help them in, well, they've been experts in the technology or disruptive look of things, different way of doing business. They've sought out expertise in leadership and how to connect with their people and to engage. And so that's still going to be needed, and it's still important in this age of artificial intelligence. So that combination of skill sets that don't have to all be in one person. So if you talk about Mark Zuckerberg, maybe he should have a chairman of the board that's helping with these things. Maybe he needs a leadership coach to help them work on those areas. That would be part of my response.
Georgia, I think that's such a great question, and one that I think is a concern to even the highest levels of technology companies. For example, Elon Musk spoke recently saying that he thinks that AI is more dangerous than nuclear weapons. And so I think that even folks who are running companies that include this type of technology are very concerned about it as well.
Okay, we've got time for one more. Failing that, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Great work. I mean, this is fascinating, and particularly from the human side equation, because it's been talked about, but I don't think people have actually taken a stab at it and starting to make sense of it and meaning of it. Did any conversations come up about, I guess, group dynamics associated with artificial intelligence? Because if some of the conversations on particularly organizational infrastructure and resources change, that may have an impact on what the boundary and the centralization, formalization, the whole structures of how these organizations may potentially look, and then how those interactions may evolve. And quite often we talk about leadership at this high level, or possibly how it works for the people producing the work, but there's this middle space in how the organizations function and run. So did any of the respondents talk to that?
Thank you. That is the glaring hole in our research, and what we're hoping to do, and we've actually got the agreement of some of the people we interviewed, is to find out what's happening in the middle of organizations. We really want to talk to the team leaders in the teams that are actually using this for real, and the people on the ground. Because what we do know is that there's just a range of attitudes. I interviewed a patent attorney, who's in her 30s, and she is hugely excited at not having to do a load of grunt work, so she can be a lot more creative and actually offer her clients, who are mostly technology clients, better advice for using, by looking at where there are lots of patents and directing her clients to areas where there are very few patents. So she sees it as an opportunity to be creative. But then, the people they have this huge records team with all the patent records. They're going to lose a lot of jobs. There'll probably be one or two super data technicians looking at the output. So we're hugely conscious that we need to find out what's happening at the team level and at the coalface of these organizations. And I suspect it's a whole range of stuff. It's like people in the digital natives, they see it as really exciting, and they think organizations are crazy not to be using this stuff, and why can't we get it in more quickly? And then, as people get, it's not just an age thing, but we do notice that difference.
I can add two very quick stories to that. One, I was at a presentation where the presenter held up a little black box and said, "This is Stella." I think I may have the name wrong. This is Stella. It has a security pass, and it actually processes fraud data in one of the banks. It's on the payroll. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and I thought that was just an anomaly until I read a report about there's a Scandinavian financial services institution that has a board member that is also a black box, and they feed data into it. They then have their discussion, and then they see what thing comes out, and that's paid sort of a euro cent a year salary. So it's actually on the payroll of the company. So these things are moving on. But this is a conversation. We're very happy to continue it. As you probably gathered, we've become quite geeky. So, which for me has been a huge transformation. But what I'd like to do is just ask Michael if he'd just say a few words to close us out, and also to thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. So the first thing we have up there is, you heard, the research continues, kind of ... It's like the saga continues. There's much more research to be done. As Mike said, we're geeky about it. We want to keep going this. We think it's huge. It's only going to get bigger. The way AI impacts our society. One of the things we talked about as a team is like MIT, which already was very involved in artificial intelligence, just got a $1 billion grant to create a school of artificial intelligence. Not just looking at the technology part, but the implications on the humanities side and how it'll affect society. So there's many different ways that our research could continue. Liz talked about some of the ways about within the organization, not just the top, but looking at the middle and the people on the ground. how factions might develop within an organization, how to look at minimizing that and speeding the adoption of the success of the AI. We wanted to look more into how leadership theories that are out there can kind of close the gap so that we can advise people in these organizations how to be more successful as they bring that in. We are thinking about as a team or some subset of us, we might do coaching, consulting, training, sharing this with others. And then finally, as Georgia invited us to publish in the journal, we'd love to publish our findings in a leadership journal or a book. And so there's lots of different ways we'd like to continue to collaborate. We really enjoyed working together as a team. Even though we were meeting in 3 different geographic locations and many different time zones, we've really enjoyed it. It was at this conference, it was the first time we all got together in person. And but we enjoyed the journey. There's a few thanks that we like to give, in particular, the Muller Institute that helped bring us together, the ILA, which was fantastic at helping us adopting the ways that we might want to present, answering our questions, supporting this research and inviting us to present. The University of San Diego, the School of Leadership and Education Services, where Taylor is based, helped us in many different ways in addition to helping give us Taylor's time as our team member. Churchill Consultants is my company, and we wanted to thank Dr. Georgia Sorensen for her support of us along the way and helping us along. And of course, our interviewees, we're very grateful that they gave their time to share their thoughts with us in a very candid and open way. And for all of you for participating, coming to this session. And we want the conversation to continue. Just like our research will continue, we'd like the conversation to continue. So we've created a website. It's leadinghumansandmachines.com. We invite you to go on there. We plan to put up this Prezi presentation up on that website. We'll also hope to post a video from this session if you wanted to review it or share it with others. We'd encourage you to do that. We also have a section of how you can contact us so we can have that dialogue. We're looking for more people to interview. We'd love to hear your thoughts as we continue our work together. So with that, we'd like to wrap it up, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to all of our team members. It's been an awesome journey that will continue. Thank you.